Uh, I think for me, getting to actually spend time around her, be around her, get to know her personally.
For weeks, Caitlin Clark was getting hit on court in ways that shouldn't happen to any player in the WNBA. Silent. The league that should have protected her stayed quiet while fans fumed and analysts looked the other way. Then something shifted. The voices that started speaking weren't from league offices or PR teams carefully crafting statements. They came from the NBA, not generic praise.
She's just an amazing person, an amazing player. She deals with a lot, there's a lot of rhetoric behind her that she really has no control over.
Either. These were unfiltered, honest takes from some of basketball's biggest names. And when they started talking about her, it wasn't just compliments. It was a wake-up call. What made this moment different is who felt compelled to speak. These weren't just fans or media personalities. These were NBA All-Stars, MVPs, and legends who rarely.
And I think that the way she handles that is just amazing. Like, I think when it comes to the game of basketball, like, she's probably top 5 most famous people that are playing right now, just in general. That includes our league.
Step into women's basketball conversations, let alone get this passionate about defending someone. The fact that they couldn't stay silent tells you everything about what Caitlin Clark has actually become. She's not just a WNBA player anymore. She's forcing the entire basketball world to pick a side. The split that emerged reveals something basketball has never really dealt with before. Some of the league's biggest names stepped up without hesitation, others chose a different path entirely. And what they each decided to say or not say tells a story about where basketball is heading and whether the sport is finally ready to fully embrace excellence, regardless of where it comes from. Nobody expected the NBA to become the voice defending a WNBA player. That's not how the sport has ever worked. The NBA exists in its own universe. It has its own drama, its own narratives, its own problems to solve. Women's basketball has always been separate, treated as important within its own context, but not exactly prioritized in conversations about basketball's future or its biggest moments. But Caitlin Clark changed the math on that assumption. What happened over those weeks wasn't just regular play. There's contact in basketball, there's physicality. But what started happening to Caitlin crossed into something different. She was getting targeted, intentionally hit in ways that looked personal, that looked like a message was being sent. And the worst part, the WNBA watched it happen and did nothing. No statement, no fines, no investigation, no "we're looking into this." Just silence. The kind of silence that tells players and fans that it's acceptable, that the league has decided to look the other way. That silence created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, something unexpected happened. Players from the NBA started paying attention, not because they were forced to or because of some coordinated PR effort, but because what they were seeing violated something fundamental about how basketball should work. If you watch someone get systematically targeted and your league does nothing, at what point do you speak up? For some NBA players, that point came much faster than anyone expected. The dynamic is important to understand because it explains why these statements matter so much more than typical celebrity endorsements or social media praise. These NBA players weren't trying to go viral or make headlines. Most of them knew what they were saying would attract attention, but they also knew they were stepping into something controversial. When Steph Curry says he's sick of watching something happen, he's not being casual. When LeBron James connects Caitlin's arrival to fundamental changes in how a league operates, he's not just making small talk. When Tyrese Halliburton talks about understanding what she's dealing with on a personal level, he's acknowledging something that takes courage to articulate. The reason this matters is because the NBA's silence on women's basketball has always been deafening. NBA players have mostly avoided stepping into those conversations because there's no percentage in it for them. It's not their league, not their problem, not their responsibility. But Caitlin Clark's situation broke that pattern because it wasn't about basketball theory anymore. It was about a player being mistreated and a league refusing to protect her. That's something different. That's something that speaks to basic principles about how the sport should work. What makes the NBA involvement even more significant is what it reveals about Caitlin's actual impact. She's not just talented. She's not just breaking records. She's changed something fundamental about how basketball is perceived. The fact that some of the most prominent voices in the NBA felt like they had to speak up about her treatment tells you that she's moved beyond being a story in women's basketball. She's become a basketball story, period. She's relevant to the entire sport now, not just her league. And here's what's crucial: they didn't speak up because they were asked to or because there was some coordinated campaign. They spoke up because they'd watched long enough and couldn't stay quiet anymore. Pascal Siakam wasn't expecting to be asked about Caitlin Clark. Steph Curry didn't have a prepared statement ready. They were responding to something they'd witnessed, something they couldn't ignore, something that felt wrong enough that staying silent felt worse than speaking. That distinction matters because it proves this isn't manufactured drama or media hype. This is genuine reaction from people who understand basketball at the highest level and who are recognizing that something real is happening. When Luka Doncic, a guy who doesn't do interviews unless absolutely necessary and who's known for being direct to the point of being blunt, volunteers that Caitlin Clark is his favorite women's basketball player, he's not doing it for PR. He's doing it because he means it. The NBA silence on women's basketball had always been convenient. Convenient for the narrative that women's basketball exists in a separate space, important but parallel. Convenient for avoiding conversations about pay equity, investment, infrastructure, and respect. Convenient for everyone involved to just not think too hard about why the best female player in basketball gets a fraction of the attention of the 100th best male player. But Caitlin Clark made that convenience impossible. She's too good, too visible, too transformative to ignore. What these NBA players started doing was essentially breaking the fourth wall on an unspoken agreement about how basketball's hierarchies work. They were saying out loud that those hierarchies don't actually hold up when you look at what she's doing. They were legitimizing her not as a good women's basketball player, but as a basketball player, full stop. And that's a much bigger statement than it might seem on the surface. The setup for everything that happens next is understanding that these players were responding to a vacuum. The WNBA created it through silence. The media had been divided about how to cover Caitlin, sometimes elevating her, sometimes using her as a weapon in other debates. The fans were passionate but not enough to force change. So when NBA players started speaking, they were filling a space that desperately needed to be filled. They were saying something that should have been obvious from day one. This player deserves protection, respect, and recognition for what she's actually accomplishing. Pascal Siakam isn't someone who usually gets caught up in women's basketball discourse. He's an elite two-way player, a champion, someone focused on his own game and his own league. So when he was asked a simple question about which player gets the most love, the expectation was a safe, diplomatic answer. Something about respecting all players, celebrating the growth of women's basketball, that kind of thing. Generic, forgettable, checked off the box. Instead, Pascal went somewhere completely unexpected. He didn't just mention Caitlin Clark, he compared her directly to NBA players. He said she gets more affection than Tyrese Halliburton, the Indiana Pacers superstar point guard. That comparison isn't random. Halliburton is one of the most exciting playmakers in the NBA right now. He's the kind of player that basketball purists love because he makes everyone around him better. He's got range, court vision, confidence, and an understanding of the game that goes beyond just putting the ball in the basket. For Pascal to say that Caitlin gets more love than Halliburton is massive because he's not comparing her to other women's players. He's broken the invisible barrier that separates the leagues and put her in the same conversation as NBA talent. That's recognition that hits different. What makes this even more important is that Pascal clearly thought about this answer. He's not the type to just say random things. When he talks about basketball, he's analytical and deliberate. So the fact that he chose this specific comparison and delivered it with conviction suggests he'd been thinking about Caitlin's impact for a while. He wasn't reacting in the moment. He was confirming something he'd already observed, that she's transcended her league in terms of cultural relevance and basketball legitimacy. That's not a small thing to admit if you're an NBA player, because it means acknowledging that someone outside your league is genuinely competing with your world for attention and respect. The significance of Pascal's statement is that it changes the conversation from "she's great for women's basketball" to "she's operating at a level of impact that rivals NBA superstars." That's a fundamentally different claim, and it's one that he was willing to back up publicly. Then there's Obi Toppin, who approached this from a completely different angle. Obi's not known for long speeches or deep analytical breakdowns. He's more of a vibe guy, someone who plays with flair and energy and lets his game do the talking. But when he started talking about Caitlin, something genuine came through that you can't manufacture in an interview. He talked about seeing her courtside, about the energy she brings to games, about comparing her presence to what he and his NBA teammates bring. And crucially, there was no hierarchy in how he framed it. He didn't say she's great for women's basketball. He said the energy and joy he sees from her is comparable to what happens at NBA games. That's peer recognition. What's important about Obi's take is the emphasis on feeling over statistics. He wasn't breaking down her shooting percentages or her assist numbers. He was talking about the vibe, the presence, the way she impacts the people around her. That matters because it suggests that her influence goes beyond the numbers. She's changing how people experience basketball when they watch her play. She's bringing something to the sport that transcends whatever league she's playing in. Tyrese Halliburton took it a step further by adding a personal dimension that the others couldn't access. He's in the same city as Caitlin, he's actually around her. He's watched her deal with the pressure in real time, seen her handle the hits and the criticism, understood what her day-to-day existence looks like. When he spoke about her, it wasn't abstract, it was concrete. He ranked her in the top 5 most famous basketball players in the world right now, and he included the entire NBA in that ranking. Think about that. LeBron, Steph, Jokic, and then Caitlin Clark, that's the tier he put her on. But what really separated Tyrese's comments is the empathy. He talked about all the rhetoric surrounding her that she has absolutely no control over. He talked about the way she handles that pressure and called it amazing. He wasn't just validating her as a basketball player. He was defending her as a person dealing with something almost impossible. And that's crucial because it shows that the recognition from these NBA players isn't just about basketball. It's about acknowledging what she's carrying off the court and saying that deserves respect too. The three of them, Pascal, Obi, and Tyrese, represent a category of NBA player who saw Caitlin and recognized legitimate excellence. Not as a novelty, not as a story, not as impressive for women's basketball, but as real basketball talent operating at the highest level. They didn't soften their language or hedge their bets. They put it out there directly, and in doing so, they created a lane for other players to speak up without it feeling like they were breaking some unspoken rule about staying in your lane. LeBron James doesn't speak casually about anything. Every word he says is examined, analyzed, dissected by thousands of people looking for hidden meaning. That's the burden and the power of being the most prominent basketball player of the last 2 decades. So when LeBron decided to speak about Caitlin Clark, it wasn't a throwaway comment. It was a carefully considered statement that carried weight throughout the entire basketball community. What LeBron understood that some people were missing is that Caitlin's arrival in the WNBA isn't just about one player being really good. It's about the infrastructure changes that her presence is forcing to happen. He pointed specifically to something concrete. For the first time in WNBA history, the league chartered a plane, private flights. That's not symbolic. That's real, tangible evidence that something fundamental has shifted. And LeBron connected that directly to Caitlin's impact. He was saying that her presence has forced the league to operate at a different level, to invest in players differently, to take their star players' needs seriously in ways they hadn't before. Why is that important? Because LeBron knows what it's like to be the player who forces those kinds of changes. He's experienced the moment when a player becomes so valuable, so central to a league's identity that the organization has to fundamentally restructure around them. He's lived through being the face of a league and all the pressure, scrutiny, and impossible expectations that come with it. So when he spoke about Caitlin, he wasn't just complimenting her. He was acknowledging that she's operating in that same stratosphere. What's particularly significant about LeBron's take is that he defended her not just as a player, but as a catalyst for change. He talked about how everyone's looking to attack her, looking to splice her words and create negative narratives, looking for an angle to tear her down. And then he said something powerful. Despite all of that, what he loves is that she's bringing more people to watch women's basketball. She's increasing viewership, creating excitement, forcing the league to upgrade. She's making the sport better just by being in it. That's the kind of comment that only someone who's operated at LeBron's level can make with credibility, because he knows what it costs to be that person and he's validating that the cost is worth it for what's being built. He's not saying it's easy or that she shouldn't have to deal with the pressure. He's saying that despite the pressure, what she's accomplishing matters more than the noise surrounding her. Tree Young came at it from a different angle entirely, which is fitting because Tree's whole basketball identity is about being different, being confident, being willing to do things that other people won't. When asked about Caitlin Clark, he didn't give a generic response. He actually went deep into what connects them, the statistics. Only 2 players in NCAA history have led the nation in both points and assists in a single season. Tree and Caitlin, that's an exclusive club. That's not something you accomplish by being good. That's something you accomplish by being exceptional at multiple levels of the game simultaneously. What matters about Tree bringing this up is that he's establishing a peer connection. He's saying essentially, we've done something that almost no one else has done, and I recognize that about you. That's different from saying she's talented or impressive. That's saying she's in a category with him, and he's willing to publicly acknowledge that connection. Tree took it even further when he said he'd be willing to do a 3-point contest with her at the All-Star game, and the way he phrased it was important. He said he'd have to practice a lot more than he has for previous contests. That's not trash talk, that's respect. He's essentially saying, I take you seriously as a competitive threat, which is the highest compliment one elite shooter can give another. The difference between how LeBron and Tree approached this is revealing. LeBron looked at the systemic impact, the broader implications, the way Caitlin's presence is forcing the sport to evolve. Tree looked at the individual excellence, the specific skills, the peer-to-peer recognition of someone operating at the highest level. Together, they established 2 different ways of validating Caitlin Clark, as a transformative force for the sport and as an elite individual talent worthy of respect from other elites. What both of them share is that they didn't soften the language or hedge the message. LeBron didn't say she's impressive for women's basketball. He said she's bringing real value and forcing real change. Tree didn't say she's a great female player. He put her in a statistical category with himself and proposed competing directly. That's the kind of unfiltered recognition that matters because it removes the qualifier. It stops treating her as a female player and just treats her as a player, competing at the highest level of basketball. The fact that 2 of the NBA's most recognizable voices were willing to make these kinds of statements without hesitation or equivocation tells you something crucial. The old way of talking about women's basketball in relation to the NBA doesn't hold up anymore. You can't look at what Caitlin Clark is doing and honestly say she's not elite. You can't witness the impact she's having and say it's not real. And that's what LeBron and Tree were confirming. Paul George has always been different in how he approaches conversations about basketball. He doesn't jump at the chance to be controversial, but he also doesn't shy away from saying things that other people might be thinking but are afraid to articulate. He's thoughtful, measured, and interested in understanding the whole picture rather than just taking a surface-level stance. So when he spoke about Caitlin Clark, he didn't do what most of the other NBA players did. He didn't just celebrate her. He complicated the narrative in a way that was both more difficult and more honest. What Paul George understood is that celebrating Caitlyn doesn't require ignoring the real pain that exists in the space around her. The women who came before her, who fought for every inch of space that women's basketball occupies, are watching someone arrive and immediately get everything they never had. That's not Caitlyn's fault. She didn't ask for this or orchestrate it, but it's real and it hurts, and Paul George was willing to name that. He did it in a way that wasn't accusatory toward Caitlyn. He didn't say she did anything wrong. He didn't diminish her accomplishments or suggest she didn't deserve the attention. He just pointed out that there's a human cost to what's happening, and that cost is being paid by the veterans who paved the way. The players who played in empty gyms, the ones who didn't have agents or sponsorship deals or national television coverage, the ones who pushed for every infrastructure improvement, every investment, every small victory that the league eventually achieved. And now someone's arrival is immediately transforming the league in ways that took decades for them to even get glimpses of. What's powerful about Paul George's take is that it actually strengthens the argument for protecting Caitlyn rather than weakening it, because by acknowledging the legitimate grievances of the old guard, he's also making clear that those grievances shouldn't be directed at Caitlyn. The problem isn't that she exists or that she's getting attention. The problem is systemic. The problem is that the WNBA was never invested in by its league the way it should have been until one generational talent made it impossible to ignore. That's not Caitlyn's responsibility to fix, but it's also not something that can be resolved by tearing her down. Paul George didn't frame it as poor Caitlyn versus mean veterans. He framed it as a complicated moment where different people are dealing with different emotions for completely legitimate reasons. That's more sophisticated than most of the discourse around her has been. Most people were taking one side or the other. Most people were either all in on defending her or part of the group talking about how she's getting protected while others were disrespected. Paul George was saying both things can be true at the same time. What's important about this perspective is that it humanizes the tension without endorsing it. He didn't say the hits were justified. He didn't say the animosity was acceptable. He said it's understandable given the circumstances, and that understanding that doesn't mean accepting it. In fact, understanding it might actually be the path toward moving past it. Because if you understand why veterans feel the way they do, you can address that directly rather than pretending it doesn't exist. Paul George also did something else that matters. By bringing this perspective into the conversation, he was essentially validating that there are legitimate conversations to be had about equity, about investment, about how a league decides to allocate resources. He wasn't saying Caitlyn doesn't deserve what she's getting. He was saying everybody deserves what she's getting, and the fact that they didn't until now is the real problem. That's a different kind of defense than what the other players were offering. Pascal was defending her elite talent. Obi was defending her presence and energy. Tyrese was defending her character and how she handles pressure. LeBron was defending her impact on the sport. Tree was defending her as a peer. Paul George was defending her from a structural standpoint while also acknowledging the legitimate grievances that were fueling the animosity toward her. What makes his take even more important is that he could have just stayed silent or added his voice to the chorus of support. Instead, he did the harder thing. He waded into the complexity and tried to articulate something that most people were either too afraid to say or too caught up in their own position to recognize. He said, yes, she's incredible and deserves protection. And also, yes, there are real historical inequities here that shouldn't be erased just because one player finally forced the league to pay attention. The subtlety of Paul George's position is that it removes any excuse for the animosity toward Caitlyn while simultaneously demanding that the sport address the real issues underneath it. He's not saying people's frustration isn't valid. He's saying that frustration should be directed at the systems that created the disparity, not at the player who benefited from a generational talent finally emerging. By speaking this way, Paul George was essentially calling the entire league to a higher standard. He was saying we can celebrate Caitlyn and acknowledge the pain of the veterans and commit to doing better going forward. All three things can happen simultaneously. And that's not as easy or as emotionally satisfying as just picking a side and defending it fiercely, but it's the most honest version of the story. Luka Doncic is not a guy who does interviews unless he absolutely has to. He's not interested in playing the media game, in crafting narratives, in saying things designed to please people. When he does speak, he's direct to the point of bluntness. He says what he means and he means what he says. So when someone asked him who his favorite women's basketball player was, the expectation wasn't a deep dive into women's basketball discourse. The expectation was probably a short answer or a deflection. Instead, Luka gave a one-word answer, Caitlyn Clark. That's it, no explanation, no context, no hedging. Just a clear statement of preference from one of the most talented players in the NBA. When they pressed him on it, asking if he meant Paige Buchers, he clarified he hadn't seen Paige play in the WNBA yet. He wasn't diminishing Paige's talent. He wasn't saying she's not good. He was making a very specific distinction. College excellence and professional excellence are different things. Paige was great in college. Caitlyn is proving she's elite at the professional level, and that's what he respects. This distinction matters more than it might seem on the surface. In basketball, there's always been this conversation about translating from college to the professional game. It's not a given. Great college players don't always become great pro players. The speed is faster, the athleticism is higher, the understanding of the game is deeper. So when Luka made that distinction, he was acknowledging something crucial. Caitlin hasn't just been good in a different setting. She's made the jump, she's proven herself at a professional level against elite competition. What's important about Luka's take is that it's coming from someone who knows exactly what it takes to perform at the highest level. He came into the NBA as a kid, a teenager really, and he didn't need a lot of time to prove he belonged. He was immediately excellent, immediately performing against the world's best, immediately showing that he was a generational talent. So when Luka looks at Caitlin and nods when he says she's his favorite women's basketball player without any qualifier or explanation, he's making a very specific claim. He's saying she's made it through the same baptism he went through, she's proven herself. The beauty of Luka's response is its simplicity. He didn't need to give a long explanation about what makes her great or how she's changing women's basketball or what she means for the future of the sport. He just said directly that she's the best women's basketball player he watches, that she gets his respect as a player. That's the kind of recognition that doesn't come with a lot of fanfare but carries a lot of weight because it's coming from someone who himself is elite and who has very specific standards for what excellence looks like. There's also something in Luka's response that's worth noting. He didn't tie it to any narrative outside of basketball. He wasn't praising her for breaking barriers or fighting through adversity or any of the storylines that sometimes get attached to players from underrepresented backgrounds. He was just saying, as a basketball player evaluating another basketball player, she's the best in her league. That's pure basketball respect, which is sometimes the most powerful kind because it strips away all the other stuff and just focuses on the game. What Luka's response does is validate that Caitlin has truly crossed over from being a women's basketball story to just being a basketball story. When one of the most talented players in the world watches her and decides she's his favorite female player, that's not coming from a place of trying to be supportive or progressive. That's coming from a place of genuine basketball appreciation. He's watched enough to form an opinion, and that opinion is clear. The interesting thing about Luka is that he's never been one to care about public perception or to say things designed to make him look good. He's a guy who plays the game his way, who doesn't explain himself, who doesn't do apologies or PR corrections. So when he said Caitlin Clark is his favorite women's basketball player, you know it's real. There's no calculation behind it. There's no strategic thinking about how it'll be perceived. He just gave his honest take, and that honest take is valuable precisely because it's so straightforward. In a landscape where a lot of the conversation about Caitlin involves complicated narratives about women's basketball, about equity, about her impact on the sport, Luka just cut through all of it and said, "She's the best player in that league, I respect her, she's my favorite to watch." That's a more powerful endorsement than a long explanation could ever be. What Luka also inadvertently did was set a standard. When a guy like him says someone is elite, that becomes harder to dispute. You can't say she's overrated or overhyped or getting attention she doesn't deserve when one of the most talented players on the planet is openly choosing her as the player he most enjoys watching. That's a different kind of credibility than even the detailed analysis from other players provides. The directness of Luka's take also removes any room for the kind of discourse that sometimes surrounds Caitlin, where people try to diminish her by saying she's being protected or propped up or given more credit than she deserves. Luka doesn't do that. He doesn't play politics. He just watches basketball and forms opinions based on what he sees. And what he sees, apparently, is a player worth respecting above all others in her league. That matters. Steph Curry has spent the last decade plus changing how basketball is played. He revolutionized the three-point shot, made distance shooting an art form, and became the standard for what elite scoring looks like in the modern era. He's been the face of the NBA's evolution, the guy who made the impossible look routine. So when Steph Curry speaks about basketball, the basketball world listens with a specific kind of attention. He's not just offering an opinion. He's speaking from the mountaintop. That context matters when understanding what happened when Steph finally decided he'd seen enough of what was happening to Caitlin Clark. He didn't start by praising her shooting range or breaking down her assist numbers. He started by saying something much simpler and much more direct. "I'm sick of watching Caitlin getting attacked. If the league doesn't step up and protect her, things are going to get ugly real fast." That's not a compliment, that's a warning. That's someone with enormous platform and credibility saying that what he's witnessing has crossed a line. And when Steph Curry says something like that, people pay attention. It's not just his words. It's the fact that he rarely uses his voice for things like this, so when he does, it carries weight that comments from others might not. What Steph was doing was drawing a line in the sand. He was saying that there are certain basic standards for how players should be treated, and Caitlin Clark has been falling short of those standards. He was also implicitly criticizing the WNBA for not doing more to protect her. He was saying that if things continue on this trajectory, there's going to be a reckoning. The way he phrased it, "things are going to get ugly real fast," suggested that he's not just concerned about Caitlin's well-being, he's concerned about the precedent being set. He's concerned about a league allowing a player to be targeted without consequence. But Steph didn't stop there. He went deeper into something that only he could really articulate with the credibility he has, her actual game. He talked about breaking down her release time and noting that it's essentially identical to his. Now, Steph Curry is the best shooter in NBA history. When he says something about shot mechanics and release, people listen. He wasn't just saying her shot is good. He was saying her shot is comparable to his, and he'd done the work to actually analyze it and understand what made it special. Then he talked about her confidence, her range, her flair, her presence as a performer. The word performer is interesting because it's not a word often used to describe athletes. It suggests something beyond just the mechanics of the game. It suggests presence, charisma, the ability to draw people in and make them want to watch. Steph was recognizing that Caitlin has something that goes beyond statistics. She has a presence that commands attention. And then he said something that resonated throughout the basketball community. She has the total package. From Steph Curry, that's not just a compliment, that's validation. That's him saying she's operating at the level of the elite players in this sport. That's him saying she does multiple things at the highest level the way he does, the way LeBron does. The way only the truly transcendent players do. What's powerful about Steph's response is that he highlighted her floor game with the same emphasis he gave her shooting. He talked about her passing, her court vision, the subtleties that true hoopers see but casual fans might overlook. He was essentially saying that people who only focus on her shooting and the controversy around her are missing the full picture. She's a complete player. She affects the game in multiple ways. She makes everyone around her better. The fact that Steph Curry, the guy who literally changed how basketball is played, looked at Caitlin Clark and saw someone operating at a similar level of excellence is massive. He's not saying she's as accomplished as him. He's saying she's demonstrated the skill set and the basketball intelligence that puts her in an exclusive category. He's saying she belongs in conversations about elite players, period. What Steph also did by defending her so vocally and then diving deep into technical analysis was provide a counter-narrative to all the drama and controversy. He was saying, in essence, let's step past all the noise for a second and just talk about what she's actually doing on the court. Because when you do that, it's undeniable. She's elite. She has the skills. She has the feel for the game. She has the presence. She has everything you need to be great. That's a torch-passing moment in a very real way. Steph Curry has been the standard for excellence in modern basketball. He's been the guy that everyone points to when they talk about game-changing talent. For him to look at Caitlin Clark and say she has the total package is him essentially anointing her as someone who should be treated with the same respect and recognition that elite players receive. He's not saying she's as accomplished as him yet. He's saying she has the tools and the intelligence to get there, and the basketball world should be watching. The anger in Steph's words, sick of watching, adds another dimension. It's not clinical or detached, it's personal. He cares about this enough to let that emotion come through. And that emotion is backed by technical understanding and respect for what she's doing. He's not defending her just as a symbol or a cause. He's defending her as a fellow basketball player who recognizes excellence and respects it. Sometimes what players don't say carries as much weight as what they do. Jason Tatum was asked a simple, straightforward question: who's your favorite WNBA player? It's the kind of thing that's been asked of NBA players constantly over the last few months. A chance to show solidarity, to celebrate the growth of women's basketball, to add your voice to the chorus of support that's been building for Caitlin Clark. For most players, it's an easy layup. You praise the rising star, you show that you're paying attention, you signal that you care about the sport expanding. It's good PR, it costs nothing, and it aligns with what a lot of other prominent voices are already saying. Jason Tatum chose a different path. When asked about his favorite WNBA player, he didn't hesitate. A'ja Wilson. A'ja is fantastic, a multiple-time champion, one of the most dominant players in the league. She's absolutely deserving of recognition and respect. But that's not what Tatum's answer was about. A'ja Wilson was not the story of women's basketball this season. Caitlin Clark was. Everyone knew it. Everyone was talking about it. And Jason Tatum, one of the biggest stars in the NBA, was given a chance to acknowledge that story and chose not to. What makes it even more notable is the flatness of the response. There was no warmth, no explanation, no "I respect what both of them are doing," just a name delivered matter-of-factly and then nothing. It was the basketball equivalent of looking away. It was a choice, and choices like that are statements in their own right. Whether intentional or not, Tatum was signaling that he wasn't interested in being part of the Caitlin Clark conversation. The significance of Tatum's non-response is that it represents a specific kind of power move. He wasn't attacking her. He wasn't saying anything negative. He was just refusing to acknowledge her at a moment when she was being universally celebrated by other major NBA figures. That refusal itself becomes a statement. It says something about how he views the moment, what he's willing to endorse, which conversations he's willing to participate in. And here's what's important: Tatum knows exactly how his words will be received. He's intelligent enough to understand that being asked about Caitlin Clark and choosing to discuss A'ja Wilson instead would be noticed. It would be interpreted, it would matter. So the fact that he did it anyway suggests deliberation, not ignorance. He knew what his choice meant and he made it anyway. Then there's Kevin Durant. Durant is different from Tatum because he actually did more than just avoid the question. He actively undermined Caitlin's position. When asked about his favorite female athlete, he didn't name Caitlin Clark. And then in a follow-up, he specifically highlighted Angel Reese, the player who's become most associated with the animosity toward Caitlyn, the player who's been part of the narrative suggesting that Caitlyn's success has come at the expense of other players. This wasn't accidental. Durant is a media-savvy guy who understands how coverage works. He knows that by highlighting Angel Reese, he's sending a message. He's saying in subtext that he doesn't think Caitlyn Clark is the story. He's signaling that there are other players deserving of attention and that Reese is his choice. And in doing so, he's not just avoiding Caitlyn, he's actively creating a counter-narrative. What makes Durant's move more calculated than Tatum's is the specificity of it. It's not just a passive refusal to participate, it's an active choice to spotlight someone else, someone who's been positioned in opposition to Caitlyn. And that choice has weight because Durant has enormous influence in how basketball narratives get shaped. His voice matters. When he speaks, people listen. So his decision to specifically avoid Caitlyn and instead highlight her primary critic is more than just a personal preference. It's a statement about where he stands. The contrast between Durant's move and what other NBA players have been doing is striking. While Steph Curry is defending Caitlyn, while Luka is choosing her as his favorite, while LeBron is contextualizing her impact, Durant is doing the exact opposite. He's using his platform to suggest that someone else is more deserving of attention. That's not neutrality, that's a position. What's particularly interesting about both Tatum's and Durant's approaches is that they came after the momentum had clearly shifted in Caitlyn's favor. After multiple major NBA figures had praised her, after the narrative had solidified around her being transcendent, they chose to position themselves differently. That's notable because it means they were making an informed choice. They knew what the consensus was and they decided to stand apart from it. The question is what motivated those choices. Is it resentment about the attention Caitlyn's getting? Is it a feeling that she's been overprotected while other narratives have been sidelined? Is it something more personal, based on interactions or perceptions we don't have access to? We don't know. But what we do know is that both players felt strongly enough about their position to go against the grain of mainstream NBA support. What this creates is a split in the NBA's response to Caitlyn Clark. On one side, you have players like Curry, LeBron, Luka, Halliburton, and others actively defending and celebrating her. On the other side, you have Tatum and Durant choosing not to participate in that celebration, or in Durant's case, actively opposing it. That split is important because it reflects something real happening beneath the surface. This isn't universal agreement about how to respond to Caitlyn Clark. There are genuine divisions about how to view her, what she represents, and how the basketball world should engage with her. And those divisions matter because they show that Caitlyn's success has forced a moment of reckoning in professional basketball. You can't be neutral about her anymore. You either see her as transformative and deserving of protection and respect, or you see her as part of a narrative that's overshadowing things you think are more important. The players who are speaking up are taking sides, and the ones who are staying silent or choosing differently are taking sides too. The split between NBA players defending Caitlyn Clark and those who aren't is more significant than it might initially appear. This isn't just about one player or one season. It's about fundamental questions that professional basketball has been avoiding for decades. It's about what the sport values, who gets protected, whose stories matter, and how power gets distributed in a league that claims to care about growth and development. When Pascal Siakam says Caitlyn gets more love than NBA All-Stars, he's making a claim about her cultural relevance. When Steph Curry warns that things will get ugly if the league doesn't protect her, he's making a claim about what should be non-negotiable. When LeBron points out that she's already forcing systemic change through infrastructure improvements, he's making a claim about her impact going beyond basketball. These aren't small statements. These are establishment figures saying that Caitlyn Clark has transcended her league and entered a conversation about the sport's future. But Tatum's silence and Durant's strategic undermining represent a different position. They're saying, either implicitly or explicitly, that they're not on board with whatever narrative Caitlyn Clark represents. They're not willing to endorse what so many other major figures have endorsed. They're positioning themselves as outside of that consensus. And what's interesting is what that tells us about the basketball world right now. The basketball world is dealing with something it's never really had to confront before: a women's basketball player who's undeniably elite and undeniably more interesting to some people than many men playing in the NBA. That creates a cognitive dissonance for a sport that's been built on hierarchies. The NBA has always been the premium product. Women's basketball has been respected but secondary. WNBA players have been impressive within their context but not compared to NBA players. That's been the way it works. Caitlyn Clark broke that. She's so good, so visible, so culturally relevant that those hierarchies don't hold up anymore. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. It's uncomfortable for people who have invested their identity in the NBA being the best basketball. It's uncomfortable for people who have benefited from maintaining the status quo. It's uncomfortable for people who just aren't ready to imagine a world where women's basketball isn't secondary to men's basketball. What the NBA's divided response to Caitlyn reveals is that there's a real reckoning happening. Some players, the ones speaking up, have already made peace with what Caitlyn Clark represents. They understand that excellence is excellence regardless of gender. They understand that transcendent talent deserves to be recognized and celebrated. They understand that protecting her isn't about lowering standards for women's basketball. It's about maintaining standards for how all elite players should be treated. They understand that basketball is bigger than the NBA and that women's basketball is becoming a legitimate part of that larger basketball world. Others haven't made that peace yet, or they don't want to make it, or they've decided that making it would require them to challenge things about the sport that they're not prepared to challenge. Whether it's resentment, fear, or just a different prioritization of what matters, they're choosing to position themselves differently. They're not participating in the celebration. They're not acknowledging her transcendence. They're not saying what so many others are saying, but here's what's crucial: they can't ignore her. Tatum could choose not to mention her when asked directly, but he was still asked. Durant could choose to highlight someone else, but he was asked about Caitlin's dominance. They can position themselves outside the consensus, but they can't make the moment go away. That's the power of what Caitlin has created. She's forced herself into conversations even for people who would prefer she wasn't there. The bigger picture here is that Caitlin Clark has fundamentally changed what's possible in women's basketball. She's proven that you don't need the investment of a major sports league to be interesting or transcendent. You don't need the marketing machine of the NBA to capture attention. You just need to be that good and that committed and that willing to bear whatever weight comes with being something new. She's also proven that women's basketball can exist in the same conversation as men's basketball without anyone losing something. The NBA hasn't been diminished by Caitlin's arrival. The sport hasn't been hollowed out by her excellence. Instead, basketball has expanded. More people are paying attention to the sport. More conversations are happening, more games are being watched. The pie has gotten bigger. For the players who have chosen to defend her and celebrate her, they've understood this. They've recognized that defending Caitlin Clark isn't about attacking the NBA or diminishing men's basketball. It's about expanding what basketball can be. It's about saying that excellence deserves to be recognized wherever it appears. It's about understanding that the future of the sport might look different from the past, and that future could be better. For those who have chosen to position themselves differently, they're essentially betting that the old hierarchies will hold, that women's basketball will remain secondary, that Caitlin Clark will eventually be contained within her league and stop challenging the boundaries of how the sport is structured. History suggests they're betting on the wrong outcome, but that's what they're doing. The most important thing to recognize is that Caitlin Clark has made choice impossible. She's forced every major player in the basketball world to decide where they stand. She's forced the NBA to engage with women's basketball in ways it never has before. She's forced conversations about equity, investment, protection, and what excellence actually means. She's done that not through activism or protest, but simply by being that good and refusing to shrink to make anyone comfortable. And that's her real power. Not that she's changing the narrative about women's basketball, though she is. Not that she's breaking records, though she is. But that she's forcing the basketball world to expand its conception of what's possible. She's making it impossible for the sport to ignore women's basketball or treat it as secondary. She's proving that basketball's future might not look like basketball's past. The NBA players who have recognized this and stepped up to defend her are on the right side of history. They're understanding that protecting her and celebrating her elevates the entire sport. The ones who haven't are betting against a tide that's already rising. And in basketball, you don't want to be betting against a transcendent talent and the momentum she's already created. What started as silence from the WNBA became a conversation that the entire basketball world couldn't avoid. NBA players who rarely engage with women's basketball found themselves compelled to speak. Some did it to defend her, others did it to position themselves differently, but everyone ended up taking a stance. Caitlin Clark didn't ask for this moment, but she's created something undeniable. She's forced clarity where there was once ambiguity. She's made it impossible to stay neutral about women's basketball's place in the broader basketball conversation. She's proven that excellence speaks louder than league boundaries. The NBA's divided response reveals that the sport is at an inflection point. The old hierarchies are being challenged. The old certainties are being questioned. The idea that women's basketball should remain in a separate, secondary space is no longer tenable when you're watching a generational talent perform night after night. What happens next matters. The league's response matters. The continued support from players like Curry, LeBron, and others matters. But most importantly, Caitlin Clark's continued excellence on the court matters. That's where real change happens, not in statements or defenses, but in performance. And she's already proven she's capable of delivering at the highest level. The torch has been passed. The question now is whether the basketball world is ready to fully accept what that means.